a practical demo. Let's start with the APIs. So part of the API management, we have the APIs view. Let's go to the development environment of these APIs. So basically, we can start the development of APIs with the specification first methodology, so to say. So we would define the API specification. And in Frends, we utilize Open API Specification 3. So for instance, if you would now create a new API, we just need to configure the Open API Specification 3 as we wish to give the needed functionality, needed endpoints, what are the methods, and so on. So for instance, if you would make, let's build a new API, funny product API. I'm planning to build an API that exposes one endpoint that returns product information with jokes. So that's why it's going to be funny. So yeah, let's give the correct parameters. Funny product version 1, good. Returns a list of funny products. Let's give the path product. Yes, it's going to be get method, good. And then let's quickly configure the schema for the 200 response. So yeah, let's return array. It's going to be, no, I'd say let's return array, yeah, items, type, let's return an object with properties like name with a type string, then for instance ID with type, let's give it a number, and then let's give a joke per product, and type will be string. So now we can see the endpoint, which is product on the right hand side, returns a list of funny products, and let's stick to the happy case scenario where we are returning 200 and the actual string containing objects with name, ID, and joke. Good. So now, if you are ready with the API specification, and of course, in real world, these specifications are much more massive. They have multiple different endpoints and so on. But let's be happy with that for now. Let's save it. And here we have the funny product API. And now, as we configured, we have one endpoint. And in Frends, when we are talking about APIs, behind every API endpoint with a certain method, we have a Frends process. So now we can create the process for that endpoint, which actually provides the data that we are requesting in this API. So let's click Create New Process. And now we are guided into the process editor. And here we can see that we have a trigger ready here as we're using API. And then, of course, we have the return element for that process. So in short, all the Frends functionality now needs to be visually represented behind these two elements. So we have the trigger and the return. And of course, in Frends, when building different kind of processes, we could have multiple triggers. For instance, we can have scheduling or manual. In manual scenario, it would require a user in the processes view to click the process to run. And of course, we can schedule them. We can look for files on a drive. And of course, if we are using a file trigger, that requires the agent to get access to a certain file directory and so on. And then we can utilize conditional trigger, which basically allows us to pull a sub process, whether it's making API calls to a backend systems or database queries or looking for certain files or whatnot. Basically, we are determining an interval, and if that sub process then returns something else than empty string or null, then we kickstart the process. And of course, we can publish more simple HTTP endpoints as well. Of course, the API is one which we actually have here already. And then the last three triggers are for different messaging queues. Queue is AMQP 1.0. And then the service bus is Azure Service Bus, and RabbitMQ, well, it's RabbitMQ. But yeah, let's stick to the API trigger for now. And then we just need to define and drag and drop these different elements to provide the functionality. So for instance, if we would like to now get some data from a database, we just need to drag and drop the first element. And in Frends, we talk about tasks. So that's one or the most atomic function in a process. And we have something like 250 odd different tasks for all kinds of use cases, whether they are API calls, database queries for different databases, file handling, SFTP transfers, conversion, data conversion, encryptions, and so on. And it's also key to know that we have a site for all the different Frends tasks.frends.com. So here are listed all the different tasks we utilize. And some iPaaS solution providers talk about connectors, but we consider them also tasks because, for instance, if we are, let's say, encrypting stuff or converting files, that's not connecting. So that's about tasks. And yeah, we have loads of different tasks for different kinds of use cases. So feel free to check these out. So yeah, then we just need to define what is the task that we want to use. We can, of course, scroll the different options we have, but of course, we can type in, for instance, SQL. So now we can make a database query. Let's select the SQL execute query. Good. Let's give it a name, SQL select products. Good. So now you can see, for instance, for this task, we have certain parameters, and all the different tasks have their own parameters depending what the task actually provides. For instance, for this SQL task, we need to give the actual SQL query. We can utilize parameters for sanitation of the query. Of course, then the connection string, which tells what database are we connecting to with what username and password, for instance. Of course, there might be some options as well. And some of you already might have seen the link to GitHub because all the tasks we are providing are open sourced in GitHub. So for instance, everyone can have a look at it. How does it work? And it's all C#. And for instance, we can have a look, how does that actual database query, what does it do? So if we search for execute query, so on code level, when that actual task is executed in the code, this function is called. So it's very easy to then see how does those tasks work if you have some concerns, or you can also build your own tasks. We provide a task template which allows you to write your own C# code and incorporate basically .NET libraries to be used in the Frends process. Good. So then we can configure the SQL task. So I'll type in a simple query. I have one database in mind which we can use. So let's take from sales lt.product. And then we need to define the connection string. And of course, now comes the first low-code reference in Frends. So when we use double curly braces in a input field which is type text, we can reference different variables here. We can make references to environment variables. We can make references to triggers, to all the elements we have in the process, all the data we have in the process. So for instance, if we want to get the connection string from environment variables, that goes with #env.something. And here we have a list of environment variables we could use. And for instance, this use case, we can use the AdventureWorks connection string. And of course, we can have a look at how do these environment variables look like in its own view. So here we have the same AdventureWorks environment variable. So of course, corresponding to the environments we have in this Frends environment or Frends control panel, we have development environment, which has its own connection string, and then in the test connection string correspondingly, and in the staging and production and so on. So when that process with that task, with that environment variable reference is deployed from development to test, Frends picks up the corresponding environment variable value. Basic stuff with environment variables. So good. Now we have our first task set up. So now we can, for instance, test it out while we are developing by clicking on the advanced settings and clicking create new test. So now on the right-hand side, we have the test panel where we just configure the parameters, and we need to select on what agent are we executing this actual task, because nothing is executed in the control panel as a reminder, but they are executed, all the integrations and tests are executed on the Frends agents. So now we can run it by click run. So what happens under the hood is now from the control panel, there goes a message via service bus to the agent that, hey, run this task with these parameters and return the value for the user to see on the UI. And here we can see the SQL task was executed with some sort of start time with a duration. And now here on the result, we have the actual data we are getting from the database. So it's basically a JSON array with 10 product informations. Good. So now we can tweak the actual query a bit. Let's give it product ID name with color for some reason. So, and we can of course have a look at the API we designed and expect what are we returning for the API caller. Yeah, we need to return a name, ID, and a joke. Good. So maybe we can just take the color away for now. Good. So we have the SQL query ready. Then we need to think about, okay, we need to get the joke for all the product objects. So how do we do that? There are a few different options. We can, for instance, loop through the list we got from the SQL task, and then we can make, for instance, HTTP calls to a backend system, which then gets the joke per every product, and then we can return it. So we can utilize this for each element. Let's give it some parameters. Let's give the iterator in the variable field, which is going to be product. And when we are referencing in this for each element, the iterator, it's going to be done in #var.product. And this is just a comment. We can easily comment the processes so that they become more readable and understandable. But as a reminder, how do we reference the iteration? It's #var.product. And then on the expression field, we need to give the input for that for each loop. So if we are looping the previous task's result, because it's a list, then we can just reference #result, and in brackets, we have the task name. Good. So now we can think about the iteration. So what happens first? Okay, we can make the HTTP task to get the joke. Then we can just type in HTTP. So we are then given the results for different HTTP related tasks. So we can use the HTTP request task for now. And again, here we have the parameters for that task, a bit different to SQL query, of course. But for instance, if we want to get a joke, I can has that joke.com. Good, we can get a joke from there, and let's give it some HTTP headers. And I wonder what it was. I think it was text plain to get the data. And of course, we can test it out again. Let's run the test and see, do we get a dad joke from this endpoint? Good. And now in the result, we get a few properties like body, headers, but we are interested now in this body. So it says we get a nice joke from there. Good. And let's give the task a name, HTTP get dad joke. Good. So now, as every iteration we are looping through the list of products, we are making an HTTP call to get the joke. And then, of course, usually the integration use cases are not that simple that we can just use these ready-made tasks without manipulating the data in any way. And that's why it's common to use code elements where we can utilize C#. So for instance, in this code element, we can modify the iterator, meaning we can do a simple C# code, and we can, for instance, modify the data. So let's do it like so. Let's type in some C#. And now we are making reference to the iterator, #var.product. Good. And then we are giving the product a new parameter, which is going to be product.choke. And now we are making reference to that previous HTTP task with the hashtag result. And yes, let's define in brackets. We're utilizing the HTTP get that choke, which is the previous task, and .body. Good. So now we are modifying the iterator. Good. Let's give it a name, modify iterator. Good. And then we might be happy with that. So now we are modifying the data. We are injecting, so to say, the choke, and then we can connect to the return. And now we are returning the data to the API caller, so which means we need to define how do we get the HTTP content. So we can, again, in a text type field, we can use double curly braces to shut down my colleague for sending me messages. But yeah, now we can make a reference to the for each element. So hashtag result in brackets for each, which is the previous element, or we can, of course, make references to the SQL task result, which we then modified with this iterator. And then, of course, we can return it as the HTTP content, and now the API caller will get the list of product information with the choke injected into it. Good. So now we might be happy with our process, and of course we can document these processes as we wish. We can utilize these sort of visual elements to represent, for instance, data store. We can give them colors if it helps the readability, and of course we can comment these as well. Good. So now we might be ready with this implementation of the product API endpoint. Let's give it a description, and the description works as a git commit message basically. And let's give it initial save, so that this will be then visible on the change log. And on the bottom, we can click validate, which allows us to see can it be compiled. Seems like no, we are missing something like so. Let's check it again. Good. Process compiled successfully. Excellent. Now we can create a new process by clicking create new process. And now we have a working endpoint in the funny product API. We can see it right here. And of course, it's visible in the processes because, like I said, it is a process just like any other Frends process in terms of visibility and the basic functionality. So here you can see it, the product get endpoint. And of course, we can activate it. So it can be then called. Now it has an activated API trigger. And of course, in the API management view, we can go to see the Swagger UI. And now it's key to understand that these Swagger UIs are exposed from the agent and not from the control panel. So the URL is self-demo-dev-agent.frendsapp rather than salesdemo.frendsapp.com. But yeah, we can try it out. Let's see if it works on this Swagger UI. And of course, we can make HTTP calls to it as we wish. And like so. So we got, you can, of course, we can do it with a curl as well. So we get the data. whether it's from the Swagger UI or from any machine, basically. And of course, when we're talking about APIs, we can configure the authorization and authentication in place as well. But yeah, feel free to try that out. I did already. And now in the response body, we can see the data. So we have product ID, name, although these differ from the API specification. So we might need to look into that. But yeah, now we have injected the jokes to all the different product objects, like we can see here.